It was late evening in Portland, Oregon, the kind of quiet that hums after rain. I stood in the hallway holding a plate of dinner, staring at my son's locked door. He had started locking it every night, shutting himself away like the world inside was his secret. I used to think he needed space, but that night, the smell of burnt fabric slipped through the crack beneath the door, and my heart went still. I didn't know it yet, but behind that lock was the last piece of his childhood, turned to ashes. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and stay till the end, because what I found inside still haunts me. The hallway light flickered softly that night, casting thin golden lines against the wooden floor. I stood in front of his door again, the same door that had once been covered with stickers of cartoons and stars. Now it was plain, silent, locked. The keyhole glowed faintly from the lamp behind me, and I could hear the faint shuffle of movement inside. It had become routine. Every night, the sound of that lock turning, the metallic click that separated my world from his. He said it was for privacy, that he needed quiet to study. At first, I believed him. I had always respected his space, but lately, even the way the air shifted near that room felt wrong. When I left food by his door, it stayed untouched until morning. When I knocked, I heard the same dull answer from within, not angry, not loving, just tired. The kind of tone that builds walls brick by brick. The smell was what began to haunt me. At times faint, at times sharp. Something like burnt wood mixed with old fabric. I scrubbed the kitchen counters, cleaned the vents, checked every socket. But it always came from the same place. Beneath that door. The scent of something ending. Some nights, when the house grew quiet, and the city beyond Portland's hills hushed under rain, I'd stand by that door, listening. I could hear faint rustling, sometimes a sound like paper tearing, sometimes a muffled thud. It didn't sound dangerous, just desperate, like a person fighting invisible battles. I started leaving small notes by his tray, gentle reminders that I loved him, that I was here if he ever needed to talk. None of them came back. Once I found one torn in half, the ink blurred by something wet. I didn't ask why. Mothers learn not to ask when the truth already hurts. One evening, as the wind rattled the windows and the streetlights flickered through the drizzle, I heard it again. The lock sliding shut, the handle turning twice for good measure. My chest tightened with a strange kind of loneliness. That door had once been my comfort when he was small, keeping the world away from his fears. Now it was the thing keeping me away from him. I looked at the hallway mirror and saw my reflection. Older, tired, holding a tray of food that had gone cold. My hand trembled as I reached toward the handle, fingers brushing the cold metal. I didn't turn it. Instead, I stood there, frozen, waiting for a sound that never came. The rain grew heavier outside, tapping against the window like a clock counting down to something I couldn't name. I could almost hear the rhythm of my heart syncing with it. One beat for every unanswered question. What had I missed? When did love turn into distance so thick it felt like fog? For a long time, I thought about the first day I moved into this house with him after my husband died. The rooms had felt too big, too empty, but his laughter had filled them easily. Now, standing before that same door, I couldn't even remember the last time I'd heard that sound. Sometimes the silence of a child hurts more than their anger, because anger means there's still fire left. Silence means it's all ash. That night, I went to bed but couldn't sleep. The sound of that lock kept echoing in my head. Not the metal itself, but the finality of it. A sound that says, "You can't come in." I stared at the ceiling for hours, watching the shadows crawl across the walls, thinking about all the times I had tucked him into bed, all the nights he had cried from nightmares, and I had stayed by his side until morning. Now I was the one awake, afraid of the dark, waiting for a door to open that never would. In the distance, the rain finally stopped. The air felt cold and damp. I got up and walked to the hallway again. The clock on the wall showed nearly 3 a.m. The house was asleep, but I wasn't. I pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. Just silence. The kind that feels heavier than noise. I whispered his name softly, out of habit, out of hope. But the sound died before it reached the other side. I pulled back, turned off the light, and walked away slowly. My footsteps echoed softly across the wood, lonely like an old memory. That night, I sat by the kitchen window, looking out at the streetlights glowing against the mist. The city beyond was still alive, people laughing, cars moving, lives unfolding. But inside my house, everything was still. The air smelled faintly of burnt cotton again. Something was happening behind that door. I didn't know what yet, but I knew it wasn't peace. A mother always knows when quiet turns dangerous. The tray of untouched food stayed on the counter until dawn. When the first light broke through the clouds and hit the window glass, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down, watching the steam rise and fade. I promised myself I wouldn't interfere, that he was grown, that he needed space. But somewhere deep inside, under every reason and excuse, my heart whispered a truth I couldn't silence. That door wasn't keeping him safe anymore. It was keeping him hidden. I told myself one thing as I watched the morning light spill across the floor. Someday, when that lock finally opens, I'll be ready. Because love can wait at a door for years. But fear always finds a key. There was a time when that same locked door didn't even have a key. It stayed open to laughter, to tiny footsteps running down the hall, to a boy whose world was small but safe. Back then, the house in Portland echoed with warmth. The walls still smelled faintly of cinnamon and detergent from the quilts I washed every Sunday. That was the rhythm of our days. Soft, familiar, gentle. My son had been a quiet child, shy around others but endlessly curious. He used to crawl onto my lap with his blanket clutched in his arms, the one I had sewn for him when he was 5. The fabric had tiny blue stars stitched into it, uneven but bright. I remember staying up past midnight, with a weak lamp, threading the needle again and again until each corner held a promise that he would never feel alone, not even in the dark. I called it his little sky. He carried it everywhere, to bed, to car rides, to the doctor's office. It wasn't just cloth, it was comfort made visible. Every mother sews pieces of herself into something. Some use words, some use patience, and some, like me, use fabric. He was afraid of thunderstorms back then. Every time the clouds rolled over Portland's rooftops, he'd run into my arms, his blanket clutched to his chest. I'd hum softly until the trembling in his shoulders eased. I used to think the sound of rain would always mean safety for him, because it once meant shelter. But years change. Meanings just like seasons change their colors. When he started school, I'd tuck that same quilt at the foot of his bed each morning, a little reminder that he was loved. I can still picture his room, walls painted light green, toy cars scattered under the dresser, the faint smell of crayons and soap. Every corner had a memory stitched into it. His laugh when he built something from Lego, the way he'd hide behind the curtain pretending I couldn't see his shoes, the trail of cookie crumbs I always pretended not to notice. It wasn't a big house, but it felt like the whole world to us. His father had already passed by then, a heart attack that came too soon. I was left with bills, grief, and a little boy who looked too much like him. I worked extra shifts at a bakery downtown near Pioneer Courthouse Square, sometimes coming home after midnight. But even on the hardest nights, I'd stop by his room, kiss his forehead, and whisper that he'd never have to face anything alone. The sight of that blue-starred blanket resting beside him always made me believe the world was still good. He used to tell me he wanted to be an astronaut. He'd sit on the floor, head tilted toward the ceiling, and ask how many stitches it would take to reach the moon. I'd laugh and tell him the same number it takes to hold a mother's love together. Countless. Those were the kind of small conversations that fill your heart without you noticing. The kind that fade slowly but never really leave. Then came the in-between years, the ones no one prepares you for. The laughter began to fade. Around the same time, the voice changed. His toys disappeared into boxes, his music grew louder, and his door began to close a little more each day. I told myself it was normal, that every child drifts for a while before finding their way back. I didn't know that some drift so far they forget where home was. He stopped needing the blanket, or at least that's what he said. One morning, I found it folded neatly in the closet. The edges were frayed from years of holding, but the blue stars still shone. I placed it back on his bed, and that night, it was gone again. That's how it began, quiet, invisible, like dust settling on something you don't realize is breaking. I still remember one Christmas when he was 13. The city lights shimmered along the Willamette River, and we walked through the market downtown. I bought him a small silver keychain in the shape of a star. He smiled faintly, but didn't hold my hand like before. The distance between us had already begun to build. Later that night, I saw him toss the keychain into a drawer. I didn't take it personally. Love doesn't stop when it's ignored. It just waits. The blanket stayed hidden for years. I thought maybe he'd outgrown it. Children do that. They shed their pasts like old skin, and we mothers keep the pieces in secret drawers, telling ourselves they'll ask for them someday. I still kept his old drawings tucked in a shoebox under my bed. Stick figures of us holding hands, our little red house drawn too close to the sun. Looking back, I think the day I stopped seeing the blanket was the day he started hiding himself. But I never threw it away. When the world began to harden him, when the weight of adulthood pressed down, when the laughter in his eyes dimmed, I'd take that blanket out sometimes and run my hands across the stitches. Some had loosened, but they still held. I used to whisper that love doesn't fade. It just waits for a reason to be remembered. I didn't know he would one day remember it by burning it. Now, when I think of those soft nights filled with lullabies and fabric stars, it almost feels like another lifetime. The room that once smelled of baby powder and crayons would later smell of smoke and regret. But in my memories, he is still small, still safe, and I am still whole. Because before the locks, before the silence, before the ash, there was a boy, a blanket, and a promise sewn under Portland's soft rain. The change didn't come all at once. It arrived quietly, like fog rolling in from the Columbia River, soft and gray, blurring everything that used to be clear. At first, it was just small things. Doors closing, meals skipped, laughter missing from the mornings. My son stopped joining me for coffee on the porch. He used to sit there before school, watching the sunrise spill gold across the rooftops of Portland, always asking what I thought the day would bring. Now I drank alone. He said he was tired, that work had become harder, that he needed space. I understood, or at least I told myself I did. But mothers always know when tired means something else. His eyes stopped meeting mine at breakfast. His voice lost its softness. He would come home late, walk straight upstairs, and I would hear that familiar metallic click, the sound of the lock sliding into place, the first time I smelled it, that faint burning scent. I thought it was from the stove, but it wasn't. It came from upstairs, something bitter, sharp, like fabric and smoke. It lingered in the air, seeping through the vents. I called up once, asking if he was ironing, if he had left something on. His voice came back through the closed door, distant and cold. I don't even remember what he said anymore, only how it felt, like being shut out of your own home. The house began to change with him. The walls that had once echoed with noise became quiet. The pictures on the hallway stayed dusty. The clock above the kitchen sink ticked too loudly. It was as if every sound was reminding me of the ones that had gone missing. He kept the curtains drawn upstairs. Sometimes, when I passed his door, I could see the faint orange glow of light underneath. It wasn't bright. It flickered, uneven, as if from candles or fire. I wanted to ask, but fear makes silence easier. You start telling yourself you're imagining things because the truth feels heavier than the doubt. I tried to make dinner one night, his favorite chicken stew, and called him down. He didn't answer. I left it on the table, covered, and sat by the window, listening for his footsteps. Nothing. Hours passed, and the stew went cold. When I went upstairs to knock, I heard something faint on the other side. Paper rustling, a whisper of movement. Then silence again. That's when I realized how far he had drifted. The boy who once ran to me for every scraped knee, every broken toy, now lived 10 steps away but felt a world apart. I'd stand outside his door, holding a plate, my hand hovering over the handle, and wonder if love was supposed to feel like trespassing. The neighbors noticed too. Mrs. Harlan from across the street asked why she hadn't seen him lately. I smiled politely, said he was working late. It was easier to lie than to explain a loneliness you can't name. Because how do you tell someone your child is right upstairs, but already halfway gone? Nights became the hardest. I'd lie in bed and listen to the creaks of the old house. Every sound became a question. Every silence became an answer I didn't want. Sometimes I'd wake to the faintest sound. A sob, maybe, or something that almost sounded like fire crackling. I'd get up, heart pounding, walk to the hallway, and stop in front of his door again. Always locked. Always that same stillness on the other side. The day he started keeping the windows shut tight was the day I stopped believing everything was fine. Portland's air was heavy with summer then, thick, humid, restless, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. I told myself he was just private, just young, just healing from something I couldn't see. But deep down, the truth pressed against my chest. There was something burning inside that room, and it wasn't just smoke. I began to notice small things out of place. A burnt mark on his sleeve one morning, the smell of ashes on his backpack, a lighter left carelessly on the kitchen counter. My hands trembled when I picked it up. I almost asked. But fear has its own language, the kind that keeps mothers quiet until silence becomes unbearable. He stopped smiling. Even the small, polite ones disappeared. His voice became clipped, empty. When I asked how his day was, he'd shrug, say, "Fine," and walk away. That word, "fine," became the last thread holding our conversations together. And yet, I couldn't hate him. I couldn't even be angry. Because love for a child is not built on their behavior. It's built on the years you carried them before they even knew how to speak. I looked at that locked door every night and remembered the sound of his tiny hand knocking from the other side years ago, asking if I could come in and tell him a story. Now, I was the one waiting for permission. Sometimes I imagined unlocking it, barging in, ending the mystery once and for all. But then I'd freeze, afraid of what I might find. A mess? A secret? A truth that would break me? Love makes you hesitate even when your instincts scream. By the end of that month, even the air in the house felt different. Cold. Unfamiliar. I stopped hearing movement from upstairs altogether. No footsteps, no creaks, just silence, thick enough to suffocate. I would stand by the window at night, looking out toward the dark skyline of the city, wondering how something as simple as growing up could turn into this. I told myself he was working through something private, something that would pass. But love can be blind when it's desperate. I didn't want to admit it, but I had already started grieving. Not for a life lost, but for a bond unraveled. The truth is, the first sound I missed wasn't his laughter or his voice. It was the sound of that door opening every morning. The soft creak that told me my son was still reachable. Now, every night, that sound was replaced by one sharper, colder, final. The click of a lock that said, "You're no longer welcome." And even though I still cooked, cleaned, and waited, I knew deep down, love was now on one side of that door, and pain was on the other. It was a little past midnight when the sound came again. Faint, but different this time. Not the usual shuffle or scratch of papers. It was something softer, broken, almost human. I froze in bed, the room dimly lit by the orange glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. The whole house seemed to hold its breath, listening with me. Then it came again, a sound like crying. At first I thought it was a dream, but dreams don't make the walls tremble. I slipped out of bed, the cold floor pressing against my feet, and listened harder. It was coming from upstairs, from behind that locked door. The crying wasn't steady. It came in short, sharp bursts, followed by silence. I couldn't tell if it was him or someone else. The sound of pain doesn't belong to one person. It echoes in every mother's bones. I walked down the hallway slowly, afraid that even the creak of a floorboard might scare the truth back into hiding. The shadows of the house stretched long and thin against the walls. The clock in the living room ticked louder than it ever had. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, I hesitated. My hands were trembling, my breath uneven. Every instinct screamed for me to go back to bed, to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard. But a mother's instinct doesn't obey reason. It answers only to fear. Step by step I climbed the stairs, each board groaning softly under my weight. The crying had stopped, replaced by a sound I couldn't name. A faint rustle, like someone moving papers or fabric. The smell hit me next. It wasn't just smoke anymore. It was heavier, thicker, mixed with something metallic. My throat tightened as I reached his door. The small gap beneath it glowed faintly with light, flickering like a dying candle. I placed my hand on the handle, locked, as always. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal, pressing slightly, but I didn't turn it. The door felt alive, warm to the touch, humming faintly with whatever was happening inside. I called his name softly, hoping he'd answer. No sound came back, not even footsteps. Just silence, thick enough to hear my heartbeat. I pressed my ear against the door. For a moment, I thought I heard whispering, low, shaky, and strange. Words I couldn't make out. Then a muffled thud. My stomach dropped. I wanted to break the door open, but something stopped me. Fear, yes, but also a strange sense of knowing. Mothers don't need sight to see. Something inside me already knew the truth, that he was burning pieces of himself, piece by piece, and there was nothing I could do to stop it yet. I stepped back slowly, staring at that door. The wood looked darker than usual, the edges faintly scorched near the bottom, as if heat had licked it days before. The smell of ashes clung to it, stubborn and bitter. I wanted to scream, to knock, to demand he open it. But instead, I whispered a prayer I didn't even finish. The kind that begins with hope and ends in resignation. I stayed there for a long time, just standing in the dark hallway, listening to the nothingness on the other side. Somewhere in that silence, I felt something inside me shift. A thread of patience snapping quietly. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for him to open the door anymore. I was waiting for courage, the kind that forces a mother to face whatever waits behind it. When I finally turned away, I caught sight of the family photo hanging on the wall, the one we'd taken years ago at Cannon Beach, all wind and sunlight, our faces bright with salt air and laughter. He had been 7, his father's hat too big for his head, holding my hand like he never planned to let go. The sight of it almost broke me, because the boy in that picture was still somewhere inside this house, trapped behind wood and secrets, and I wasn't sure if he even knew it anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window in the living room, watching the fog rise slowly over the street. The world outside moved on, cars passing, the distant hum of trains, life continuing as if nothing inside my home was falling apart. I waited for dawn, like a soldier waits for a signal. My mind kept replaying the sounds, the smell, the sight of that faint glow under the door. When the sun finally began to rise, the light washed over everything, revealing the dust in the corners and the fatigue in my reflection. I made myself a cup of coffee, but it tasted like guilt, because part of me knew I had let this go on too long. Love had made me gentle when I should have been brave. As the clock struck 8, I heard his footsteps upstairs, light, controlled, calm. The lock clicked open. My heart jumped. I expected him to come down, to say something, anything. But instead, I heard the door close again. Then another click. Locked once more. That was the breaking point. It wasn't the sound of the lock that hurt me. It was what it meant. It was the declaration of a wall I could no longer ignore. I stood up, walked to the foot of the stairs, and looked up at that door one last time in the dim morning light. The air felt thick, and the smell of smoke drifted faintly again. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I simply made a decision that grew in me like steady fire. The next time that door opened, it would be because I opened it. That night, I searched every drawer until I found the small brass key. The spare one I had kept tucked away in a jewelry box since he was a child. My fingers brushed against its edges, cool and sharp. A tiny reminder that love sometimes has to hurt before it heals. I slipped it into my pocket and sat by the window again, waiting for him to leave the next morning. I didn't know what I would find inside that room. I only knew one thing. Whatever waited behind that door, it was time to face it. Because a mother's instinct doesn't need proof. It needs purpose. And mine had finally arrived. The next morning came slow and gray, clouds hanging low over Portland, turning the streets into rivers of quiet reflection. The house felt colder than usual, as if it already knew something was about to change. I stood by the window, watching the faint drizzle streak across the glass. My son's footsteps moved through the hallway above me. Steady, careful, distant. He didn't know I was awake. He never did. When the front door closed behind him and his car pulled out of the driveway, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of opportunity. I waited a few minutes, just to be sure, then walked slowly up the stairs, the brass key cold against my palm. My heart beat heavy, each step echoing louder than the last. At the top, I stood before the door that had become both barrier and burden. For a moment, I just looked at it. The handle gleamed faintly in the soft morning light. The paint was worn where his fingers had turned the lock night after night. The air smelled faintly of smoke again, mixed with something else: dust, metal, and loneliness. I slipped the key into the lock. It resisted at first, as if unwilling to surrender its secret. My hand trembled, the metal cold against my skin. Then, with a small twist, the lock clicked open. The sound was soft but final, like the exhale of truth. When I pushed the door open, a gust of heavy, stale air rushed out to meet me. It smelled of old smoke and burnt paper. I stepped inside. The curtains were drawn, blocking out most of the light. The room felt smaller than I remembered, almost suffocating. The air was thick, unmoving. Dust floated in the thin beam of daylight that slipped through a crack in the curtain. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, afraid of what I might see. The floor was covered in scattered papers. Drawings, torn notebooks, and bits of fabric blackened at the edges. The desk against the wall was cluttered with burnt candles, melted wax hardened into pools across its surface. On the carpet near the bed sat a small metal bowl filled with ashes. The smell coming from it was unmistakable. Burnt cloth. My throat tightened. I took a step closer, my knees weak, my breath shallow. The faint crunch of ashes under my shoe broke the stillness. On the desk, beside a half-burned photo frame, was a small pile of dark gray dust. I reached out instinctively, then froze. Something within that pile caught the light. A faint shimmer of blue. I leaned closer. It wasn't just ashes. It was fabric. Scorched, torn, half consumed by fire. The small piece that remained was soft beneath my trembling fingers. A scrap of cloth with faded blue stars. My breath caught in my throat. It was the blanket. The same one I had sewn with love decades ago. The one that had kept him safe through thunderstorms and long nights. I recognized the stitching, uneven but familiar, and the small corner where I had embroidered his name, half burnt away but still visible in faint thread. Daniel. My knees gave way, and I sank slowly to the floor, the piece of fabric still in my hand. My chest felt hollow, my eyes burned, but no tears came. Just a deep ache, like something inside had cracked open and was spilling quietly. The room around me blurred. Every wall felt alive with memories. The toy shelf now empty. The posters, once colorful, torn to shreds, A faint handprint of soot stained the wall above the desk, his height as a child. The ghost of who he had been lingered everywhere. I lifted the small bowl of ashes carefully and placed it on the desk. My hands trembled as I brushed aside the rest of the burnt papers. Beneath them was a photograph, edges singed, image half melted by heat. It was one of us, me, him, and his father, smiling on a park bench in Seattle, taken years ago during a summer trip. His father's arm around both of us, sunlight bright in our eyes. The corner of the photo where his father's face had been was gone, eaten by fire. I realized then that he hadn't been burning things out of anger. He'd been trying to erase something. Maybe pain, maybe guilt, maybe a memory too heavy to hold. Every burnt paper, every scorch mark, every ash pile was his silent confession. My heart broke for him, for the boy who had once believed that fire could destroy what time had already claimed, for the man who couldn't tell the difference between letting go and losing everything. The air in the room felt heavier the longer I stood there. The window pane was streaked with soot. The corner of the rug was blackened. Even the walls seemed to have absorbed the smoke. Yet beneath the ruin, something small and fragile survived. The half-burned fabric in my hands. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around, the quiet pressing in from every side. I could almost hear echoes of his childhood in the stillness, his laughter, his tiny feet running across the carpet, his voice calling for me during storms. The past and present felt layered, overlapping like transparent glass. One version full of warmth, the other cold and cracked. I didn't cry. Not yet. Grief has its own timing. It doesn't come when the fire burns. It comes with the smoke that lingers after. I folded the small piece of fabric and held it against my chest, the smell of ashes clinging to it. I closed my eyes and whispered silently to the room, not words of blame, not even of sorrow, just a mother's promise that I would not let him lose himself completely to the fire. When I finally stood, my hands were covered in soot. I wiped them on my skirt and looked around one last time. The room was still, but it wasn't lifeless. It was wounded, like him, like me. Before leaving, I opened the curtains wide. The morning light rushed in, sharp and cold, slicing through the dust. It touched the burnt marks on the desk, the papers on the floor, and finally, the piece of fabric in my hand. For the first time, the ashes didn't look dark. They glimmered faintly in the sunlight, almost silver. That's when I knew what I had to do. I would not hide the truth. I would not let this door stay closed again. Because love may burn, but it also rebuilds. One quiet act at a time. And that morning, in that small, smoke-stained room, I decided that this story, his story, would not end in ashes. The room was still heavy with smoke when I found the strength to move again. The morning light from the open curtains glowed against the dust, making the air shimmer with tiny flecks of ash. It looked almost peaceful, like a winter morning, until I looked down and remembered what those ashes were made of. Memories, burned by the hands that once clung to them. I sat on the edge of his bed, holding that half-burned scrap of fabric in my palm. The edges were blackened, curling inward like dry leaves. The faint blue stars I had stitched decades ago were barely visible, faded and frayed. But the name, Daniel, still survived in uneven white thread. I remembered sewing that name the night before his 5th birthday, my eyes tired, but my heart full. Each stitch had been a promise that no matter what storms came, he would always be safe. Now those same stitches stared back at me through soot. I pressed the fabric to my chest. It felt fragile, as though even my heartbeat might crumble it into dust. Around me, the room was a museum of pain, a shrine built from the pieces of what used to be a home. The posters on the walls hung half-torn, edges blackened from smoke. His desk held piles of notes, some burnt, some soaked in water, all unreadable. It was chaos, but not the angry kind. It was the kind born from grief, the kind that tries to destroy what it cannot forget. On the floor near the window, I saw a small tin box, its lid half melted. I picked it up, and it rattled softly. Inside were fragments of things that had once meant something. A small wooden toy car, charred at the wheels, a photograph folded too many times, and a button from the coat I wore when he was a boy. He had saved them. Even through the fire, he had kept them near. My throat tightened. It wasn't hatred that had made him burn the quilt. It was love turned inwards. Love that had nowhere else to go. The air felt warmer near the desk. I stepped closer and saw faint scorch marks climbing the wood, reaching toward the wall like black veins. The wallpaper had bubbled slightly, discolored by heat, and on the desk, next to the bowl of ashes, was something I hadn't noticed before. A silver lighter, polished and placed neatly, as though it belonged there. The initials engraved on it were H.M., his father's. My hand froze over it. That lighter had once lived in his father's coat pocket. It was the one he used every morning before work, the one he'd flick open with a little smile when he thought no one was watching. When his father died, I had kept it locked away in a drawer, too full of memories to touch. Somehow, my son had found it. Somehow, he had decided to use it. I traced the engraving with my finger. H.M. Henry Mitchell. The man we both lost too soon. The man whose absence left a hole neither of us knew how to fill. My son had turned the last thing of his father's into a tool for erasure. And maybe that was his way of saying goodbye to both of us at once. The thought made my heart ache in a way that had no sound. I sat there for a long while, staring at that lighter, the fabric, the ashes, all pieces of a story that no one outside this room would ever understand. Love and pain were woven together here, stitched tight by years of silence. I thought about the nights I used to sit by his bed, reading to him under that same quilt. He'd fall asleep halfway through the story, his small hand gripping mine. He said the stars on it made him dream of skies he'd one day see. That quilt had carried the warmth of every good night we ever shared, and now it was gone. Still, I couldn't bring myself to see only tragedy, because even in ashes, there was proof of care. You don't burn what you never loved. You burn what you can't bear to keep. I gathered what was left, the piece of cloth, the photograph, the toy car, and placed them gently into a small box I found on his shelf. The lid creaked when I closed it. I ran my hand over the top, leaving a faint smear of soot. It felt almost sacred, as if I were sealing away something fragile that needed time to heal. The room began to feel smaller the longer I stayed. The smell of burnt fabric clung to everything. I opened the window wider, letting the cool breeze from the Willamette River drift in. It carried the faint scent of wet pavement and pine, the smell of Portland after rain. Slowly, the smoke began to fade, replaced by something lighter, almost hopeful. I looked around one last time. The sunlight had reached the far wall now, painting the ashes in gold, and for the first time, I didn't see ruin. I saw release. Because what remained in that room wasn't destruction. It was proof that love, even when it breaks, still leaves traces. As I stepped out, I left the door open behind me. I wanted the air to move freely again. I wanted the house to breathe. Downstairs, I placed the small box on the kitchen table and sat beside it. My hands were still blackened with soot, but I didn't wipe them clean. They felt like the hands of a mother who had finally touched the truth. The truth that sometimes children don't destroy what we give them out of cruelty. They destroy it because they're trying to stop the ache that love brings. And though that truth hurt more than I could say, it also gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: understanding. As I looked at the box, a single thought crossed my mind, soft and sure. If love can survive fire once, it can survive it again. By the time the afternoon sun slid across the floorboards, the house had grown quieter than ever. The faint scent of burnt fabric still drifted through the air, but it no longer stung my throat. It just lingered, soft, sad, familiar. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the small box of ashes and scraps, unable to move for a while. My thoughts felt heavy, circling the same question again and again. Why would my son destroy the very thing that once gave him comfort? After a long pause, I decided to go back upstairs. I couldn't leave that room half explored. Something about the way the ashes sat on the desk, deliberate, careful, told me there was more to find. When I reached the door, sunlight was pouring through the open curtains, bright and merciless. The smoke that had once filled the space was gone, leaving behind a faint pattern of soot on the walls. I started with the drawers under his desk. The first one was empty, except for burnt paper crumbs and an old pencil stub. The second drawer stuck halfway, and I had to pull harder to free it. Inside were folded pages, stained with smoke, but mostly untouched by fire. I spread them out carefully on the desk. The handwriting was familiar, bold, sharp, and uneven. His handwriting. Each page began with a date. Some went back years. The first one read, April 9th, 2018. I started reading, my eyes scanning line by line. They weren't letters. They were diary entries, thoughts he'd never spoken, confessions he'd never trusted anyone to hear. The first few were harmless, small notes about school, work, life. But as I kept reading, they darkened. Words like, can't sleep, too quiet, don't feel real. Then came a line that made my hands shake. Every night, I see Dad standing by the door, watching me. He doesn't move. I think he's angry I wasn't there. I closed my eyes for a moment, my chest tightening. The grief that had taken me years to tame had taken him differently. Deeper, quieter, crueler. The next pages told the story I hadn't seen. He'd written about how the house felt empty after his father's death, how he blamed himself for not being enough of a man to fill the silence, how he hated the pity from neighbors, the empty words from friends. And then, one entry, written just a few months ago, stopped me cold. I found Mom's old sewing box. The smell made me remember being small again. It felt good for a second. Then it hurt. So I burned it. I set the paper down and pressed my hand over my heart. That was it. That was the truth. He hadn't burned the blanket out of anger toward me. He had burned it because it reminded him of a time when life was still whole, still warm, before loss came knocking. He was trying to erase the pain that the memory carried. As I continued reading, I found more fragments of his mind. Half-finished letters addressed to Dad, drawings of the ocean, sketches of a man standing alone at the edge of a pier. On one page, written in shaky ink, he said, Sometimes I think if I burn the things that make me remember, I can start new. But the smell doesn't leave. That sentence hit me harder than anything else, because I knew that smell. I'd carried it too. The scent of something lost forever. Near the bottom of the drawer was a smaller notebook, almost completely untouched by fire. Its cover was soft brown leather, edges singed but intact. Inside were pages filled with sketches of me. Some were quick and messy, drawn with charcoal or pencil. Others were detailed, tender, my face, my hands, my smile. Each drawing looked slightly different, like he was trying to remember me from memory rather than sight. Beneath one, he'd written a single line. I don't want to forget her voice. The realization struck me like a quiet thunder. He hadn't locked that door to keep me out. He'd locked it to keep what little remained of me, of us, inside. He'd been living among ghosts, replaying fragments of love he didn't know how to hold without hurting. I sank into the chair, tears slipping down my face for the first time that day. But they weren't the kind that demanded sound. They fell quietly, like forgiveness. After a while, I noticed a small wooden box tucked beneath the bed. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were more burnt edges, but this time, not fabric. Letters. Ones I had written to his father when we were young, before marriage, before hardship. I had thought they were gone. He must have found them after his father's death and kept them here. The top one was only half burnt, the rest still legible. My words from decades ago stared back at me. If anything ever happens to us, promise me you'll keep our home full of laughter. I smiled faintly, though it hurt. Somewhere, deep in his mind, maybe those words had become a burden instead of a blessing. He had tried to keep that promise, but life had turned laughter into ashes. I placed all the pages and sketches back into the drawer gently. Then I stood and looked around the room one last time. It no longer looked haunted to me. It looked human, the way grief really is, messy, raw, misunderstood. I walked to the window and let my hand rest on the frame. Outside, the world was alive. People walking their dogs, children shouting in the distance, the sound of a bus rumbling down the street. Life was moving forward, even when we stayed still. The breeze coming through the window carried the scent of wet earth from the garden below. For a second, I thought about planting something there. Maybe lavender, maybe rosemary. Something strong enough to grow from the soil of sorrow. As I turned to leave, my eyes fell again on the small scrap of fabric lying on the desk. I picked it up one last time and folded it neatly, placing it beside his diary. It belonged there, not as a wound, but as a marker of survival. Because I understood now. The fire had not destroyed our bond. It had revealed the depth of it. And as I closed the door gently behind me, I whispered to the empty hallway, more to myself than anyone. Sometimes love burns just to find its light again. That evening, the sky turned the color of rusted gold. The sun sank behind the trees, its light filtering through the windows of our old house in Portland, scattering across the kitchen floor like shards of memory. I sat at the table, the small box of ashes beside me, the burnt scrap of fabric folded neatly on top. The diary lay open, pages fluttering in the soft wind. Everything I had discovered was right there. The truth I hadn't been ready for, but couldn't ignore anymore. The clock ticked slowly. Each sound echoed through the empty rooms. I waited. I didn't know what I would say or how I would say it. Part of me wanted to protect him still, to hold him the way I used to when nightmares chased him awake. But another part of me knew that protecting him now meant facing what was real. When I heard the door open, I didn't move. His footsteps came down the hallway, heavy, uneven. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the table. The silence between us stretched, thin but sharp. He noticed the box first, then the diary, then the fabric. His body went still, his face drained of color. The truth was laid bare in front of him, and he didn't have to ask how I'd found it. For a moment, he looked like a stranger. The kind of man the world had worn down, the kind that carried too much grief in his eyes. But then, I saw it. That small flicker of the boy he once was, standing in front of me with dirt on his hands and guilt in his soul. He reached out, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. His hand trembled in midair before falling to his side. I could see the storm inside him. Shame, sorrow, fear, all crashing into each other. He didn't need to explain. I had already read his heart on every page of that diary. But I wanted him to find his own words, to let them carry the weight he'd buried for years. So I waited. He sat down slowly, his shoulders collapsing, his eyes fixed on the table. The first tear didn't fall like in the movies. It just appeared, quietly, sliding down the side of his cheek. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, small, like gravel dragged across dry ground. He told me everything. The loneliness after his father's death, the sleepless nights, the anger that had no place to go. How he had walked into my sewing room one day and opened a box filled with old fabric, thread, and the smell of the past. How he had touched the blanket I made for him and felt something snap inside. He said he burned it because it reminded him of a time when he was still happy, when our house was still whole, when love didn't feel like a ghost. I listened without interruption, my hands folded tightly on my lap. The words hurt, but they also healed. Because in every confession, I could hear the boy who still loved his mother, but didn't know how to say it without breaking apart. He said the lighter wasn't meant for destruction. It had belonged to his father, the last thing he kept close. He used it to control the pain, to make something tangible out of what he couldn't feel anymore. He thought if he could burn the reminders, he could burn the ache too. But the ache only grew. The smoke never left his lungs. When he said those words, I finally let my tears fall. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, soft, real. I reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were cold, shaking slightly. I didn't scold him. I didn't ask why he hadn't come to me sooner. I just looked at him, really looked, and realized that grief had made him small, but it hadn't made him cruel. He whispered, almost to himself, I just wanted it to stop. I wanted to forget the sound of you crying when he died. My heart broke again, in a quieter way this time. Because all these years, I had been mourning my husband, not realizing my son had been mourning me too. The version of me that used to laugh, to dance in the kitchen, to tell stories at night. He thought he had lost both of us. We sat there for a long time, the evening light turning to shadow, the room growing softer around us. I told him that forgetting isn't healing, that memory, even painful, is a kind of love. Proof that we were alive, that we cared, that something mattered. He nodded slowly, his eyes red, his breathing uneven. He said he didn't deserve forgiveness. But forgiveness isn't earned. It's understood. And I understood. After a while, I stood and walked to the counter. I brought the small box from earlier and placed it between us. Inside were the ashes, the burnt quilt piece, and the lighter. I opened it, then gently took out the fabric. The stars on it still faintly glimmered under the light. "This survived," I said softly, "even after fire." He looked at it, his lips trembling. Then I placed it in his hands. He held it as if it were something sacred, his eyes fixed on it for a long time. I told him he couldn't erase pain by destroying love, because love doesn't live in fabric or letters or photos. It lives in people. It lives in what we choose to rebuild after the burning. He didn't speak. He just nodded, pressing the fabric to his chest. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his eyes. Not peace, not yet, but the start of it. That night, we stayed in the kitchen until the moon rose. We didn't talk much after that. The silence between us no longer felt like distance. It felt like rest. For the first time in years, he didn't lock his door. He left it open, and I saw the light from his room flickering down the hallway. Before I went to bed, I walked past his door and paused. He was sitting by the window, the piece of fabric resting in his lap, his gaze fixed on the stars outside. It was as if the quilt had come alive again. The boy who once hid beneath it, now sitting beneath the real sky, letting it hold him instead. I smiled faintly and whispered to the quiet air, "You're home, my son." And though he didn't hear me, I knew he would feel it. The warmth returning, slowly, like the glow of embers that refuse to die. The next morning arrived, slow and silver, the kind of quiet light that makes every sound feel softer. Dew clung to the grass outside our house in Portland, and the air carried that faint smell of wet cedar that always comes after an Oregon dawn. For the first time in months, I woke up without fear. The door to my son's room was still open. Light from his lamp stretched into the hallway. Warm, calm, safe. I brewed coffee in silence. The small clinking of the spoon against the cup felt like music. When I turned, he was standing at the kitchen doorway. His hair was messy, eyes swollen from the night before. He didn't speak, but his gaze was clearer. The wild confusion had settled into something steadier, humbler. Without a word, he joined me at the table. The same table where we had cried hours earlier now sat between us like a bridge instead of a wall. We ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. Not heavy, not sharp, just shared. Sometimes healing doesn't come with grand apologies. It comes with two people sitting quietly, breathing the same air again. After breakfast, he asked if we could clean the room together. I nodded. Upstairs, the smell of burnt fabric still lingered, though fainter now. The window was open, letting in a gentle draft from the river. Dust hung in the light like tiny golden particles. He picked up the fallen pages of his diary, stacking them carefully, as if rebuilding himself one sheet at a time. I opened the closet, pulling out the torn curtain, the burnt scraps, the clothes he had tossed aside. We didn't speak, but every movement was an apology neither of us needed to say aloud. At one point, I found the small wooden box again, the one that held the toy car, the button, the photograph. I wiped it clean, set it on the windowsill, and turned to him. His eyes followed my hand as I gently folded a fresh piece of fabric, white and soft, and laid it beside the ashes. I told him we would start again, not by erasing what burned, but by giving those ashes a place to rest. That afternoon, we drove to a fabric shop downtown near Burnside Bridge, the same place I used to buy thread when he was little. The woman at the counter recognized me. Her smile was kind but curious, as if she sensed something unspoken. I chose fabric the color of morning clouds, pale blue, calm, forgiving. My son carried the rolls to the counter without a word. When I saw him do that, I realized how small actions can feel like prayers. Back home, I opened my old sewing kit. The needle was dull, the scissors a little rusty, but they still worked. I threaded the first strand of white cotton and began to sew. Each stitch was slow, deliberate, steady. He watched from the chair beside me, his elbows on his knees, silent but present. Sometimes he handed me pins or helped fold the fabric. I didn't tell him what I was making. I wanted him to see it unfold, to see how love, once destroyed, could still take shape again. Hours passed, like minutes. By evening, the new piece was finished. A pillowcase, simple and soft, stitched with the same pattern as the old quilt. Small stars scattered across the fabric, imperfect and real. In the corner, I sewed his name again. Not Daniel, this time, but just D. The rest I left open, because he was still becoming. When I handed it to him, his fingers brushed the thread gently, as if afraid to break it. His eyes welled up again, but this time not from sorrow. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that remembers how to exist. That night, we put the new pillow on his bed. The room looked lighter, cleaner. The shadows didn't hide in the corners anymore. We opened the window wider, and the cool air carried the scent of rain and life. The house finally breathed again. Later, as he slept, I stood at the doorway and looked at him. The boy I had raised, the man life had wounded, the soul that was learning to heal. His breathing was slow, peaceful. The pillow glowed faintly under the lamplight, its stitches catching the gold. And for the first time since the fire, I felt peace too. In the days that followed, something subtle began to change. We started eating dinner together again. Sometimes he would help me water the plants or drive me to the market near Pioneer Courthouse Square. The neighbors began to notice the laughter returning, small, quiet laughter, the kind that sneaks up on you. He started talking about his father again, not with guilt, but with softness. We went through old albums, repaired broken picture frames, and even framed one of his sketches. The one of me smiling. It now hangs in the hallway, right by the stairs, where sunlight touches it every morning. Healing didn't come in one day. It came in pieces, in folded laundry, in cleaned dishes, in unspoken forgiveness. Every day we added a small thread back to the fabric of our life. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the porch, holding the silver lighter. For a moment, I felt that old sting of fear. But he didn't flick it open. Instead, he handed it to me and said, "You should keep this." I took it and smiled, feeling the circle close. What began with fire was ending with peace. That night, I sat by my sewing machine again and stitched one final line into the pillow's hem, invisible to the eye, but they're all the same. Love survives everything. Now, every morning, when I pass his open door and see that pillow resting on his bed, I feel something new. Not loss, not regret, but quiet strength. The same strength that built our home once, that carried us through ashes, that will keep carrying us long after words are gone. Because love doesn't vanish when it's burned. It turns to light and waits for you to find it again. Morning light stretched softly through the lace curtains, spilling gold across the wooden floor. The house in Portland no longer felt haunted. The air carried only the scent of brewed coffee and a faint sweetness from the lilies blooming outside the window. I sat at the same table where everything had once broken apart, the same table that now held only quiet peace. In front of me lay the silver lighter, cool against my palm, and the pillow I had sewn. the small blue one, stitched with forgiveness. I ran my fingers across the fabric slowly, tracing the uneven thread where my hand had trembled the night I finished it. Each stitch held a piece of the journey: the burning, the discovery, the tears, the forgiveness. There were no ashes left, only lessons. My son came down the stairs soon after, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He poured coffee for both of us, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had softened. The silence we shared no longer carried fear. It carried understanding. He didn't need to speak. I didn't need to ask. Some things were finally healed, and the quiet between us was proof. After breakfast, he left for work, and I stayed by the window, watching the light crawl across the street. The neighborhood was alive again, children running to catch the bus, a man walking his dog, the postman whistling as he dropped letters in the box. Ordinary life, once unbearable to watch, now felt like a blessing. On the windowsill rested the framed sketch he'd drawn of me, the one I'd found in the ashes. It wasn't perfect. The lines were smudged, the shading uneven. But I loved it that way. It reminded me that nothing real is ever perfect. Love isn't neat. It's raw, stitched together from mistakes and mended hearts. Later that day, I walked to Tom McCall Waterfront Park, the same place I used to take him when he was a child. The trees swayed gently in the wind, the Willamette River glimmered under the soft light, and the distant hum of traffic felt like the rhythm of life continuing. I sat on a bench near the water, the pillow resting on my lap. I thought about how many mothers around the world sit like this, quiet, remembering, forgiving their children in silence. I realized then that motherhood is not about protecting your child from pain. It's about teaching them that pain doesn't end love. It reshapes it, sometimes into distance, sometimes into silence, and sometimes, if you're patient enough, back into tenderness. I took the lighter from my bag and held it up to the sunlight. Its metal gleamed, catching the reflection of the sky. Once, this small object had started a fire that turned love to ashes. Now it was just an artifact, harmless, redeemed. I placed it gently into the river, watching it sink beneath the water, swallowed by ripples that shimmered like forgiveness. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. When I returned home, the house greeted me with stillness, but not emptiness. Every sound had meaning now: the creak of the stairs, the ticking of the clock, the faint hum of my son's music upstairs. Life had moved on, but it hadn't forgotten us. That evening, I sat by my sewing table again, the same one that had once been covered in ash and sorrow. I laid a new piece of fabric across it, soft linen, pale cream. I wasn't sewing for him this time. I was sewing for me. Each thread was a promise that I would never let grief turn into silence again, that I would speak, forgive, rebuild. When I finished, I placed the small square of cloth inside my old wooden chest, the one filled with letters and photos from years gone by. I smiled, knowing it would wait there quietly, ready to tell its story when someone else needed it. Night fell slow and gentle. My son knocked softly on my door before bed, asking if I wanted tea. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the world turning full circle. We sat on the porch, sipping quietly as the city lights blinked beyond the trees. He thanked me, not for forgiveness, but for staying, for not giving up on him when he gave up on himself. I didn't reply. I just touched his shoulder and let the silence say what words could never hold. Later, as I lay in bed, I looked at the ceiling where moonlight traced patterns through the curtains. I thought about that night I found the burnt quilt. How the smell of smoke had made me tremble. How my heart had cracked open. I remembered the moment I realized love had not died in those ashes. It had only been hidden, waiting for air. Grief can make people burn things they don't understand. But love, real love, always finds a way back through the smoke. I closed my eyes, feeling the cool breeze drift through the window. The city outside slept peacefully, and so did I. Sometimes I still dream of the old quilt, the one with the stars I sewed by hand when he was small. In the dream, it isn't burned. It floats above us, whole again, glowing softly. Maybe that's how healing works. You don't recreate the past, you let it shine differently. So if you're listening to this now, wherever you are, remember, fire can destroy, but it can also purify. Ashes can bury, but they can also nourish what comes next. I used to think the story ended when I opened that locked door, but I was wrong. It began when I chose to open my heart again. Tell me, if you found the pieces of what once burned, would you mourn them? Or would you start stitching again?